The Transgender Journey series sprung out of a frustration with the way that mainstream liberal media covered issues around transsexuality and transgender people and politics. The discourse had been dominated for, it seemed to me, nearly a couple of decades, as long as I could remember, by a kind of radical feminist take on transsexuality in particular, that posited that transsexual people were reinforcing gender stereotypes and gender norms, and that the whole process of transition was controlled by patriarchal gender identity clinics who imposed these gender stereotypes on the people who went through those clinics, and that the people who went through the clinics and the clinicians were very much in collusion on this point. Now, I already knew before I started transition that this was a somewhat inaccurate take on the situation. The point about gender identity clinics demanding a certain type of gender presentation from the people who went through them, there was more than a kernel of truth in that. But the problem with this theory was that it ignored the fact that the relationship between patient and clinician was actually often quite antagonistic, and that the clinicians often acted as gatekeepers and historically had made it as difficult as possible for trans people to get through and complete the medical pathway. So I realised that the mainstream media discourse around trans issues was 20 to 30 years behind kind of academic and activist discourses. In the late 70s, the key radical feminist text on transsexuality, the most hostile and virulent text, was The Transsexual Empire by Janice Raymond. That was published in 1979. There were responses almost immediately from people like Carol Riddell and Ros Caveney, but the key one was, for me, The Empire Strikes Back by Sandy Stone, published in the late 80s, which argued that the exposure of the specifics of transsexual and transgender living would kind of deconstruct and destroy the stereotypes that the most aggressive radical feminist takes on transsexuality were based on. So I had a model for the mainstream media, and I tried to do much the same thing. I thought that if I could get an unlimited amount of space through blogging, which, after all is relatively inexpensive and relatively low risk, then I could use this kind of liberal conception of freedom of speech to say, well, actually, yes, here's my response to this kind of discourse. And having accepted the kind of compromise of using this journey from male to female framing that had become something of a cliche in the mainstream media, but having accepted that compromise, I could take as much space as I needed to cover all sorts of issues related to cross-gender living that I didn't really feel had a fair airing in the media before. Confessional journalism is a style of first-person writing, usually done on a kind of rolling basis, in which the author posits him or herself, it's often herself, as somebody who is sharing unusual or interesting experiences, kind of saying the unsayable in a kind of unflinchingly honest sort of way. It's a style that's become increasingly popular with the advent of internet journalism. It's relatively cheap to produce. It sort of generates a kind of celebrity columnist. If it's open for comment, it generates comments as well. So it's kind of a way of bringing traffic in. Obviously, it's got a much longer history, and confessional writing, as opposed to confessional journalism, has existed for a very long time. And of course, there are authors like Rousseau or Nietzsche who have written books in this sort of confessional style in a way that brings in a lot of politics and social commentary. Now, contemporary confessional journalism is often criticised for trivialising journalism, depoliticising it. And looking at the gender politics of confessional journalism is often very interesting. A lot of the most prominent confessional journalists now are these kind of monstrous women, these women who behave in a way that might be considered unacceptable by all sorts of sectors of society. The most prominent one at the moment is Liz Jones in the Daily Mail, and there are frequent controversies around Liz Jones's confessional writing, most notably a couple of years ago when she wrote an article about how she wanted to get pregnant and her partner didn't want her to get pregnant, so she raided a used condom after sex in order to try to do so. The Daily Mail tried to build up another journalist, Samantha Brick, as another kind of controversial, almost unbearably honest confessional journalist. But to be honest, Samantha Brick's pieces were incredibly dull and rather predictable in comparison with Liz Jones's. It usually just focused on very obvious red flags to feminists, quite tediously and quite obviously so. But I think it's a kind of interesting form that actually can take in a lot more politicisation than is often acknowledged. If a confessional journalist writes about first-person experiences in such a way as to touch upon and bring to light a wider set of social concerns for a community of which they form a part, then I think the form has a lot more radical possibility. There are a lot of pressures facing journalists and authors from minority communities. The burden of representation is a particularly complicated issue. There's kind of a sense that you have to be very careful not to be claiming to represent everybody from your community. And often you have to be very explicit about the fact that you're not doing that and you're not aiming to do that. This is a challenge because we live in a culture that only allows a certain amount of space for minority voices, even now with the advent of the internet and apparently unlimited amount of space. Even then, kind of mainstream media editors will only commission so many people of minority backgrounds, and there are kind of compromises you have to make in order to express that kind of viewpoint. I've already touched upon the sort of transitional journey framing that was expected of transsexual and transgender authors working within the mainstream media, and I'm sure it's the same for other people from different minority backgrounds. They're expected to frame their experiences in a certain way that will be understood by what's referred to as a wider audience. At the same time that you have to be careful not to claim to be representing everybody or even anybody other than yourself, there's also a pressure not to misrepresent the community as a whole. So you get the kind of negatives of wider representation more than the positives. It's interesting to think about where the trans community might fit into the radical left and what the radical left might learn from the trans community. To pick up on an earlier point, considering the link between socialism, feminism and queer politics, which I think is really important. Firstly, it's crucial to remember that radical feminism itself was actually more welcoming often to diversity of gender identity and expression that's been remembered. People like Kate Millett, Shillamuth Firestone, even Andrea Dworkin actually left more room for this kind of gender diversity than has been remembered. I think it's more a case that the left needs to make itself more open to gender variant people. If we consider the position of trans people, lots of trans people aren't radical leftists. They're not necessarily ideologically aligned because of their gender identity. In fact, I know lots of trans Tories, well, no, not lots, but I know a few trans Tories, and I've tried to explain to them that their whole being depends upon a liberal society and a functioning state-held system, and this has fallen on deaf ears. But it's not necessarily the case that trans people are radical because of their transness. But it's more a matter of affecting the culture of the radical left so that trans people who want to be involved with it feel more welcome. Traditionally, the radical left has been very poor on LGBT issues, kind of assigning gay, bi, lesbian or trans people as kind of bourgeois decadence and assigning those genders and sexualities as something that belongs to the middle class and is inherently non-revolutionary. And it's been an interesting tactic on the left to try and characterise trans people as inherently reactionary and stereotype both cross-dressers and transsexual people. The older kind of versions of trans identity try and stereotype both as inherently conservative in different ways. We've seen lately with the Julian Assange case that sections of the radical left have also been particularly poor on women's rights, and there have always been elements of the radical left that have been very poor on those. And I think getting rid of the more kind of misogynistic elements or sexist elements or just kind of inconsiderate elements of the radical left would make it more open to both feminists and queer people. In terms of the legal system, there are a number of difficulties still faced by the trans community, although there's been a real improvement in legislation over the last 15 years or so. For all its faults, the new Labour government was relatively progressive on LGBT rights. The Sex Discrimination Act of 1975 was amended in 1999 to make it illegal to dismiss somebody from employment or vocational training because of their transitional status, but that had to involve somebody going through the sex reassignment pathway. The place of kind of genderqueer or gender variant people within that was rather different, although I think that was amended by a later piece of amending. In the same year, there was a legal case in the Northwest which secured the right of people to have sex reassignment surgery via the NHS, although there are certain issues there because local trusts, what were PCTs and now clinical commissioning groups, retained the right to decide what they would fund and what they wouldn't fund. And since the change of government in 2010, there have been, as far as I can tell, a rise in the number of local trusts who are deferring or declining referrals for surgery. The Gender Recognition Act of 2004 allowed people to modify their birth certificates, apply for new ones, and have their acquired gender legally recognised. This was in response to the April Ashley case of the late 60s, early 70s, which dissolved April Ashley's marriage on the grounds that she was still legally male. And this overturned that overturned that precedent. There are still certain problems here, particularly with regards to marriage and people who had pre-existing marriages having to dissolve them before getting gender recognition. And there are some moves with the equal marriage discussions at the moment to change that state of affairs, which haven't been massively successful so far. There was also the Equality Act in 2010, which made gender identity a protected characteristic. But there are issues there that there are competing protected characteristics, and in certain situations people are still allowed to choose whether or not to admit or acknowledge trans people if they feel it conflicts with another protected characteristic. In terms of access to housing, there are still certain problems. The legislation that I've just touched upon makes it harder for people to actively discriminate in housing visibly trans people. But of course there are many subtle and insidious ways in which people can be made to feel uncomfortable in their living environment as a direct result of prejudice against openly trans people. And that's often a difficult situation to resolve. So there needs to be a kind of coordinated effort by local councils, housing organisations to provide safe housing for such people. The same goes for employment. There is legislation in place, but if employers don't want a trans person working for them, it's possible to pass over them at interview stage, or on a more subtle and again insidious level, if employees don't want a trans person around them, there are many ways to make them feel unwelcome. Now, of course, there are legal challenges that are possible to this, but these are stressful, they're difficult, they're expensive, they take a long time, they may well come with a certain amount of problematic media attention on a local or national level, and you sort of understand in those circumstances why people would find it easier to just go somewhere else. There are certain changes that I'd like to see on a social and political level that would empower the trans community I was working at the Primary Care Trust in Brighton and Hove in 2009-2010, and we were working on a citywide transgender strategy in collaboration with the police, with the Health Trust, with the council, and with Spectrum, which was a local LGBT kind of working group. And it was really great to get all these people around the table and air all the kind of coordinated issues and start looking at a way we could produce a coordinated answer to them. Now, of course, when the change of government happened in 2010, and one of the very first announcements that was made was that the primary care trusts were going to be abolished, all this work kind of went on the back burner, and I was at that job for another 18 months and the work was never resumed. So I'd like to see much more of that kind of work taken up, of well arranged citywide work where there are trans communities that can offer help to those communities and their involvement in that. On a cultural level, I'd like to see just more trans role models. I think it's very important that we have more trans figures in the media, and trans people who aren't necessarily known for being trans. I think it'd be really great if we could get to the point where you can have kind of trans people in various cultural fields who do all sorts of other things and aren't obliged to talk about their gender as a prerequisite for entering them.